Hey, John Gilroy here. Data is power. Today, a focus on how controlling data is transforming security across the federal government. Hit the music, Manny. Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, the podcast that connects you to federal technology leaders. Our guest in the virtual studio today is Angel Smith, President of Global Public Sector at Virtru. Angel, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much, John. Thanks for having us.
I'm going to spell this because I know sometimes my voice gets creaky here. Virtru. Today we're going to talk about data control, encryption, zero trust. Just 5 hours worth of topics we're going to compress into a half hour. But I think the first thing I think is important to talk about is interoperability. And everyone's talking about interoperability and connecting systems and multi-cloud environments and all kinds of things here. So where does your company fit in with a federal agency just trying to climb that interoperability mountain?
Yeah, it's such a good question, John. And I'll tell you, it's an interesting one because, a lot of people think that interoperability, there's challenges with the technology, but that's actually not normally where interoperability breaks. It actually typically breaks because there's a problem between trust or there's a policy problem or execution. And so I think if we were to kind of bucket those into three different areas. The first one is on the policy side. When policy doesn't travel directly with the data, you're left with a system that doesn't necessarily have, you don't know where the data is leaving, what the origin is, it loses context. And so what I mean by that is that we no longer have clarity on necessarily who owns the data, who's allowed to use it, under what conditions it can be used. And so this is a real problem. And a lot of people will typically try to overcompensate with that by overclassification of data, or I think worst case scenario in an allied environment, they just make the decision to not share it at all. The second component is on identity and infrastructure. And a lot of times those just don't necessarily align with partners. And so coalition operations often kind of assume that there's some type of a shared understanding of identity or access or a security posture. But that assumption really breaks very, very quickly across agencies. Multiple countries are using different clouds, different accreditation models. They've got different interpretations of what zero trust actually is. And so that kind of creates a lot of friction on the different data handoffs. And I think finally, and probably the most important of that is that, trust is typically in today's world negotiated through MOUs or some type of a manual agreement. And when you're doing that, that works really, really nicely in a kind of a training or a planning environment. But actually, when you get into operational environments, especially amongst nations, typically operational tempo just breaks that down. So, let's say that you've got another country that joins into another operational environment. There's no MOU in place, but they've got data that you actually need. Sometimes it just adds a ton of problems with it. So those are actually the areas that I think, especially in a defense operational environment, that really creates a lot of friction. It's not necessarily with the technology. It's honestly, these are human, paper generated problems. They're not technologically driven right now.
I've done many, many interviews, and I listen to podcasts. There's a podcast called the Dr. Zero Trust podcast, and Zero Trust touches on a lot of different topics. And what I think if you look, I don't know, maybe over the last 50 or 60 interviews in any technical field in the federal government, you see this focus is on networking and identity, but they're kind of missing you're doing the shell game and old angels. No. And the network and data is fine, but what are you protecting? It's the data. It's like, let's go back to square one because, there's so much data being created at the perimeter here. There's interoperability concerns and what the constant there is going to be the data, huh?
Right, 100%. I think you're exactly right. And it's funny is, when people talk about whether or not, zero trust is the right focus, I think in some ways the direction that we're going on the zero trust angle is that we got the diagnosis right, but in a lot of cases we've started to kind of treat the symptom rather than the root cause. And so, you're focusing on network and identity. It makes a ton of sense right now as a starting point, but you have to know who's accessing something, where is it coming from, where is it going? But the risk actually lives with the data itself, where it goes, how it's used, and whether or not that control is going to persist well beyond after access is actually granted to it. And so most zero trust implementations really still operate on a kind of a binary model. They authenticate, they authorize, and then implicitly, it's kind of like trust goes out the window for whatever happens next. But once that access is granted, you lose visibility and control over where the data is going. And that's, it's a problem in single organizations. But when you start to think about the complexity of a organizational, like a coalition environment or a defense industrial base that's got multiple partners, that becomes a scale problem and a much more complex problem. So are we solving the right problem with zero trust? I think we're solving part of the problem with zero trust, but I think we're missing the real control point. And the real control point, I think, exists at the data layer. And that's a fundamental pivot in the way that we've been thinking about zero trust, I think, up to this point.
I was a history major, and I'd learn about sovereignty and sovereign countries, and you learn about things on the open seas and sovereignty. Yeah. And this was a word that was in the back, my non-working memory. And yeah, I knew that in high school, and but now I see the word sovereign cloud and data sovereignty. And so this morning I used my advanced research, and I went to Google Trends, and I typed in data sovereignty, and whoop, I got that hockey stick. So this is like, I guess, in the next 5 conferences you attend, there's going to be 3 sessions mandating data sovereignty. So how do you define data sovereignty, and what does this mean for our federal listeners?
I think if you were to take a look, I think you're also going to start to see AI sovereignty pop up.
That's another one, yeah.
That's another super interesting one. And I think that I think the traditional interpretation of data sovereignty that relies super, super heavily on where data exists, so data residency, and then also, where is the infrastructure currently located at, which I think is an antiquated way to think about it, if I was to say something kind of provocative. And what I mean by that is, U.S. data sovereignty relies heavily on the fact that the data at risk is staying in continental United States or within very controlled areas. That essentially means that you're putting all of your controls about physical location of data, and anybody that works in the data space knows that that's just not the way that it works. Just because it lives somewhere doesn't necessarily mean that that's a good definition of how we should be thinking about sovereignty. And I think it's probably one of the quiet failures that we start to see in coalition operations as we start to try to figure out how we're going to harmonize those things. Every nation's got their own legal framework. They've got their own classification rules, risk tolerances, all of that stuff. And so that becomes more complicated when we think about sovereignty from kind of a central, isolated perspective. If we go, kind of to beat the drum on the individual data object, if you can start thinking about data as an individual object that you can put actual controls behind it and align your policy, then the data can move anywhere that it needs to go. And, where it physically sits or travels to becomes kind of an irrelevant variable. We don't necessarily need to have these perfectly aligned policies because the data object can control the policy, and you can control who gets it, who sees it, who does what with it. And then you can also revoke access anytime you actually, absolutely need it. The way that we think about it right now, and we think about it from this logical isolation, or not logical, it's a physical isolation in physical areas, you really start to kind of put yourself into this position of having to comply with legacy practices and not use best of breed technology any longer to be able to move data. You create these artificial boundaries that are just not necessarily helpful, especially in an AI world. Yeah. When you think about, AI makes the most sense because it's got access to the max amount of data possible. When you think about sovereignty from kind of these traditional terms, these traditional interpretations, you start to restrict your ability to get access to types of data. And if you just look at it at the data layer, it changes the whole game.
Hey, Joe, we're going to take you back to high school again, your high school history course. Now, traditionally, if your cannon could fire 3 miles, that's what your sovereign nation extended, that 3 miles. And it's almost like taking that 18th century concept and saying, let's take this border and boundary, and we're going to use the 3-mile cannon rule with a data center. It doesn't fit, does it?
No, it doesn't. I mean, really, traditional security models really slow mission down today. Anywhere where the security relies on or depends on this centralized control, manual approvals, or shared infrastructure, it really shows up in standing across when you're looking across organizations or trying to move data between enclaves or onboarding partners, even things like renegotiating permissions, at a time on a very specific mission, that starts to shift. I think the deeper issue is that we've treated security and speed like these kind of opposing forces with each other, as if you get one, you have to sacrifice the other. And I just don't think that that's the right trade-off any longer. It's an artifact of an old architecture or a legacy mindset. And we've got to start shifting agencies. They need to stop asking, how do I lock an environment down, and change that pivot that thought process to how do I allow data to move safely under some type of a persistent control wherever the mission requires it. And if you can do that, you can stop forcing operators to choose between, security and action, because the reality is like operators don't want to choose between security and, they don't want to sacrifice security. They don't want to make the choice. But when the rubber meets the road and you want them, they have to, they have to execute. They're going to make a choice. We want to be able to give them a choice that doesn't make them make that, divide that decision.
Well, my turn to ask a provocative question.
Yeah.
So is data sovereignty even fully achievable in today's interconnected world? I mean, that may be the mandate or the recommendation. Well, fine. I mean, it may be easy to pick apart. And maybe the people who are saying it's sovereign, or maybe that'd be a tough debate to win.
No, I think it's a great question. And it's one that I think that comes up all the time. I think it's achievable, but you have to a little bit throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can't achieve it and still operate with all these modern advances in technology unless you rethink the way that you're operating. You have to rethink your architecture. And so you can't, the typical data isolation is no longer relevant any longer. You don't get all of the isolation and the tools that you actually need to be able to, we've been talking for years about drowning in data, and not having access to data, not having access to all of the right data, and then being able to use all of the right data to make the right decisions across the board. And a lot of the data that's coming in, especially in a coalition environment, is coming in from, you've got, nations that are collecting off of sensors, you've got open source information, you've got all of these things. And the only way that you can actually make sense out of all of it collectively is to be able to use modern tools like agentic AI. You don't get those, and you don't get the right answers by staying isolated. And data sovereignty, in the way that you would typically interpret it, is this default to isolation. If you rethink it and you think about every single piece of data at the object level, and you put parameters around it that make it distributable to whom you want, rather than thinking about things in isolation, you change the game. And I think that you can achieve sovereignty in a much more open perspective if you throw away all of your assumptions. Stop thinking about, like, I have to, I love to say that we think about data in this like 1980s filing cabinet way. If it's in my office and it's in a filing cabinet, I know it's secure. I can rubber stamp it properly. Like, I know that's not the way data works any longer. It doesn't work like that. We have to rethink everything.
Now we talk about racing cars. So I think a balance, and I had a friend who told me that, when you race a car, if you go 167 miles an hour, you lose the race. You go 168 and you crash. And so that's how he talked about balance. And so the balance in this discussion is balancing what you called friction, or maybe security versus usability. And so Angel wants to go right up to the edge, or, I mean, most people don't. This is a tough decision here. I mean, and we talk about, usability, but, usability for someone going to a citizen-facing federal website's one thing, but, security usability for some serious environments, there's a different, now you're going 1,000 miles an hour, huh?
Yeah, right. Yeah. And there, we kind of touched on this a second ago. There's this kind of expectation that if you have more security, you don't have as much usability because there's too many restrictions on things, or things are overclassified, or, whatever it is. And admittedly, I was a Marine for a really long time. We ran into this all the time where, we would be operating with another unit from another nation, and we would have restrictions on what we could actually share, because there was some type of a restriction against the information that we weren't allowed to share with this allied nation. You really put yourself in a position to be blocked, and sometimes it's artificially. I think that kind of goes back to that security and speed discussion we had just a second ago. There's a belief that those things live in contrast with each other, but there's a harmony to be had if you can just start looking at things down to the granular level by the data object, rather than, looking at things in these 30,000 foot kind of classification levels. If you can change the way that you're looking about it at information, you can pivot the whole conversation. Speed and security can live, in concert with each other.
And the usability will be your first defense against workarounds like shadow IT and some legacy infrastructure problems, and something that no one wants to talk about is tool sprawl. And so, well, this is too hard, so I'm going to work around. So that's your best defense is having that usability there. But boy, easy, like you said earlier, so easy to talk about it, but boy, deploying it, and maybe that's where Virtru fits in, is just, hey, it's not going to force the people in your department to get their credit card out and do shadow IT, huh?
Yeah, and you just brought up something I think is also a really interesting point, John, when you talk about tool sprawl. So you've got, often you'll have organizations that they've got their preferred tools. They've got their preferred, Canada right now, for example, has really got this, a press towards, making sure that they're only using, in the technology side, they're only using Canadian-born technology and Canadian-born companies to be able to get to the Department of Defense there. The reality is that those things can coexist. You don't have to get everybody on the same type of tool set. You can, if you start looking at things from a different vantage point, you're looking at it from the object layer, the data layer, everyone can have their own tools, they can have their own preferences, they can have their own policies, they can enforce all of those things independently, because you're not forcing these isolated practices or isolated infrastructure or isolation of tools. You're not forcing this kind of commonality. You can exist and use the things that you're the most comfortable with and most familiar with, and still share without sacrifice, which is, I think it's a really, really good thing for anyone that would challenge isolationist type of behavior from industries.
I got a memo from the White House this morning that if I talk about the federal technology, I have to mention AI before the end of the interview, or I'm in really big trouble. This is a mandate, I guess. We call this a mandate here. But let's talk about AI and data governance here. So where do you see this whole trend happening, and where does your company fit in? I mean, this is not an enviable position you're in. I mean, you're going to be dealing with people at the Department of War that are big time. And now you've been in the Marine for 20 years. We know that. So you know how serious these people are. They're not going to tell dumb jokes about racing cars. So this is a serious topic for serious people. So where does AI fit in data governance here in the next few years?
Yeah. So if you were to drop AI into a mission environment, it's going to start pulling data from a lot of different data feeds. You're going to be getting intelligence feeds. You're going to get partner inputs. You're going to get internal systems. You're going to get open source information. And then, you're going to start turning all of that into some type of an actionable intelligence. And that's incredibly powerful. But I think the question is, and I always kind of come back to this, is can you trust all of the information that's getting pulled into that data source? And, and do you still control it once it actually starts moving into or out of those environments? Because, this is not operation. This is not theoretical any longer. These are operational concerns. I think if an AI model starts to pull in data from either, outdated sources, or something that's misclassified, or it comes in from a partner that maybe is not necessarily completely trusted and you didn't account for it, you're starting to make decisions based off of less than ideal information. And especially in an operational environment, that can start to get, super, super tricky. And I think where Virtru fits into this is that because we can look at everything from a data object perspective, you now have the ability to validate where the data is coming from. You have the ability to validate its relevance. You can validate its classification level. You can validate it, whether it's trusted or not, where it's allowed to go, where it's not allowed to go. And on the Virtru side, we've actually started to build some really interesting tools that give you the ability to take that data. So like imagine, John is from Australia, Angel is from the UK. You and I are trying to share information. You're classified at one level, I'm classified at another level. We can put that data together in a repository that's encrypted, but you can't see mine, I can't see yours, but we can both query against it. But I think that the thing that's probably the most incredible about some of those tool sets is you can also classify the query. Or let's say that I query something and it achieves the level level of classification. And I say, I want to share this with John. And it could say, no, Angel, John doesn't have that level of classification. You can't share that out. So and that's just because, sometimes you can aggregate a lot of different types of data at different classification levels, and maybe all of it the secret, but all of it in aggregate creates a elevated classification level. We have the tools to be able to make that classification decision and then keep you from doing something that you wouldn't normally share, at the same time validating that all of the data that you're ingesting is actually accurate and gives you the appropriate answer for what you're looking for. So all that exists. It's not, none of this is something this is where Virtru fits in. I think, again, because we're looking at everything from the data object level, it's liberating because you stop having to worry about all of the things that would no longer matter. And you start really kind of, you start seeing reality in whatever the data, whatever you're getting exactly what you expect to get out of it, because you're feeding in really good actionable intelligence that is valid and you can trust.
Angel, a lot of people listen to this podcast when they're in the squat rack or they're walking their car or something. So what I'll do is I'll put a link in the show notes to Virtru, virtru.com/federal. They get more information for this. And we're running out of time, but this whole topic of AI brings up, like, what about data fragmentation? What about workforce skills? What about rules and regulations and compliance? And maybe you'll save that for the next interview, because this is a hot topic. And I think this is a unique approach to solving this data problem, which go back to this top of the interview, data interoperability, and then zero trust in networks. No, let's go back to the data. And that's, that's where it begins and ends, I reckon, huh?
I agree. I totally agree. 100%. I think that that's probably a whole hour-long conversation to just talk about policy. But I think, honestly, if I was to leave with kind of like one statement, I would say, legacy practices have got us here. They're not going to get us where we need to go. At this phase in time, it is time to start questioning assumptions, challenging norms, and really demanding better. So I think that this is the time for us to really start to think about how we can do things differently in the data space.
There's your company T-shirt, demand better.
Yeah.
That's it. Great.
That's right.
You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Angel Smith, President of Global Public Sector at Virtru, VIRTRU.